Story time with Stephanie Story.
All right. My name is Stephanie Storey. I'm an art historical novelist, and this is my show, Story Time. My guest today is a memoirist. Her debut memoir is called Wild Ride Home, Love, Loss, and a Little White Horse, a family memoir. But I also want to talk to her about being a poet and the art of poetry, among many other things. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Welcome to the show, and thank you so much for joining me, Christine Hemp.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie.
Okay, so thank you for being here. You have written this really personal, where you have put yourself and your family out in the world in this memoir. Okay, it's hard enough for me that I'm like bearing my soul in a novel, but I get to put it under like character people and no, that's not me. How do you reveal so much in a memoir, and why did you have to tell that story, I guess is my question.
That's a great question. And people have asked me about that, some very personal stuff. And funnily enough, we're a private family, oddly enough, a pretty private family. And yet there came a time in my life when first of all, the book started as something completely different. It was about my poet adventures to wild places, like working with all white cops and all black youth offenders in Brixton, London's most violent neighborhood. I mean, my poet adventures have taken me on a whole thing. But the more I wrote, when I started that project, all of a sudden stuff started to happen in my life. My mother was at the early stages of Alzheimer's, and everything sort of happened one after, and I couldn't help but start talking about my family, because it really was about how I lived my life, and my family framed the way I lived my life. And so by the time it was done, and I'll tell you, Stephanie, it was many years, the book had become not just this intimate tell-all or anything like that. I didn't ever want it to be that. It actually became my piece of art, and it became then not just my story, but everybody's story. I mean, everyone has crisis, and everyone faces trials and tribulations. And I think like you say, why did you have to write this memoir? It wasn't until way in it, until I realized I had to write it to figure out how someone from a positive family, a yes family, could reconcile life's griefs and troubles and sorrows. And how can you reconcile that? That's what the book became about, which was scary when writing it. It was, and it was vulnerable. But by the time I was through, it's like I'd made something out of it. I mean, you write about artists, and they make something out of nothing. They carve out of marble, and they make paintings. And so what I like to think of this book as not just my life, but everybody's life, a piece of art that is separate from me now, even though, I mean, my life story is going on. So, and it's so happy making to have people write me about it and say it's like, it means so much to them. And that is a gift.
Take me back and tell the viewers at home who have not yet read your book,
Yeah.
who are going to want to read it by the end of this conversation, but set them up a little bit, because I always hate detailing other people's books, because I butcher them. Because when people try to tell other people what my books are about, I'm like, that's not right.
It's about elephant hunting in Africa. Not.
No? Like, honestly, in my retelling of your book, of what I've read, I will be honest, I haven't had a chance to finish it yet. I'm only part of the way through. I would probably focus on the horse, but that's because I am a little bit of a horse person. So
yeah, well, my horse actually provided the framework for it, and was well into the memoir. I already had a tome of all these events in the book, and I got to a place where I had it all, and I just finished a terrible illness, and I'd had to put it aside for a while. And then I brought my manuscript to Iowa, the university where I teach in the summer, and I said to my colleague, I am so sick of this memoir. So what ended up happening, I said, look, I've just made friends with this little horse, and I'm doing this training and this understanding of communication with him, and all I want to do is write about Buddy. And she just kind of raised her eyebrow and said, So to make a long story bearable, Buddy, the narrative of Buddy is the most now, what I call it in memoir, there's the then now of your old life, and then this is my language, but the then now of the old life, and the now of your new life, usually from which the narrator is telling the story in a memoir. And my now life runs like a conduit through the book. Buddy is the through line, and he reflects the situations that I face, my family faces, even things in the world along the way. So he's a kind of, parallel narrative, but he also winds into it and reflects the characters. You can call them characters, the people in the book, that, relationships reflect each other. So again, I would say that my journey in the book was to reconcile joy with the joy of my life with the inevitable losses that we face.
You said something during your last answer.
Mm-hmm.
So you said you can call your characters characters.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, for people at home who are not memoir writers, can you explain to people at home what that process is like? Because in order to write a memoir, you do, in a way, turn your own life and the own stories into your life, into characters and plots and all of those things. How was that process for you? Explain a little bit about it, and how was that process for you?
It means that dialogue becomes important, and emblematic moments become important. I worked a lot with scene, for example, and moments that moved the narrative along. Countines that meant eliminating people in my life that were very important to me in the memoir, because they didn't serve the story. Couple of my best friends are not even in the book, right? But I had to there's the art part, right? I had to serve the story, because to get the truth of the story, I had to really shine light on the characters, the people in my life who were emblematic of the story. And so that was fun. I enjoyed that. I love writing scenes. And that actually freed me up to be able to go forward, to go into a scene, even if it was painful, was a way to shape and transform the difficulties. I really think that's what art does anyway. It transforms us. So that was really fun, and I enjoyed that, especially when Buddy stepped into the whole process, because it was so fresh for me. And I wrote things down that Ken, my trainer, said that were so wise that, I mean, you couldn't not write them down. His wisdom helped me, with my relationship with Buddy. So, and with every kind of thing that's in this book, you ask me, okay, how would you describe this book? What's in it? Well, I mean, you got a big, wide range. I mean, you got fly fishing, and you've got Alzheimer's, and you've got cancer, and you've got, bad boyfriends. So what, it's kind of got, I don't know, it's just a panoply of things, but Buddy was the adhesive that gave me this wonderful thread throughout it.
Okay, so what do you hope that readers who read it, because it feels like a book club pick to me, like, right? Like, it feels like the kind of book that primarily women go to book clubs, and you sit around and you drink wine or you eat and you talk about life's issues, and you talk about your own junk and other people's junk, and you get, like, it feels like one of those books to me. So when you're picturing your ideal reader and they're at home reading it, what are you hoping that they are getting from the experience of of reading this? Because if you didn't have that idea, you probably wouldn't have published it and put it out in the world, right? Because you have
That's
to hope to
probably
have an
true.
impact. You have to hope to have an impact on your reader in some manner. So what was the impact you were hoping to have?
You know what I think, Stephanie? I think it it was that I hope that people will see the beauty in everything, even loss and grief and ugliness. And my job, I think, was to turn ugliness into beauty.
That's nice. Well, particularly at this moment when we're all living through this extraordinary moment in our
It's,
society where there is so much grief and so much difficulty and so much pain and so much
I
anguish.
know, I
Um,
know.
that's a
And
real,
people have told me that that's one of the most touching things people have said in this time. I had one writer write me and say it's the only book she could read during this time for some reason. I'm not to brag. Maybe you better cut that out because that sounds brag.
I'm not, no, I'm not cutting that out. That is a
I,
beautiful thing. And that is
I
something
just
as a writer you have to embrace.
couldn't believe it. I mean, it was so amazing. And, you know, it's such a painful time and yet also such a beautiful time. Right in the last, you know, week, things are different and in good ways as well as bad. And I hope my readers will see that and that it will not just be about my life and, you know, travails and joys, but their life and a larger embracing of all of us now when we're all vulnerable and we're all feeling very at sea, and that there are some things that are true and good and beautiful.
You started this conversation out by talking about a time when you were working with a police department, did you say, in Braxton?
Brixton in
Brixton.
London, yes. It was just a lovely time. I taught a poetry class in London, and one of the participants was the head of the Brixton violence prevention program. He said, look, I want to bring you to the Crime Prevention Trust. I had 10 black, I think it was 10 black youth offenders and 10 white cops for a week in above a pub in Brixton, and using poetry as a way to unite them. It was extraordinary, and leading those people was one of the most I was one of the most privileged moments of my life. And by the end of the week, we wrote poems all week and shared them and everything. By the end of the week, we put on a performance and all sang them together, the poems, and read them. And in this old church that was turned into a theater, it was packed. It was just incredible.
What do you think it is about the power of poetry that's still relevant today and that helped these two different groups of people find some sort of shared vulnerability? What is it about the particular art of poetry that has the capacity to do that, I think, in a very unique way?
Yes, I mean, it always has. It's our oldest language. I mean, we danced it and sang it before we ever wrote it, thousands of years before we ever wrote it. So it's in our DNA to tell our history and tell our stories. I mean, the poet used to be the historian in a tribe. So we are still doing that. It will never stop. Poetry it's our impulse. I always think of prose as more as horizontal and poetry is vertical, reaching, reaching, reaching. And even on the page, prose goes from, you know, in an order, in a horizontal way, sentences across the page, whereas a poem can be, you know, like almost like a painting, and the spaces of, you know, and the line breaks are like musical hints. And writing and poetry now, people are turning to it because it's beyond what we know as journalistic facts. It hits at another kind of truth in our humanity and in how we live and our fears and our troubles, and it just speaks something different. It's not better, worse, or anything, but it's a sacred thing. I consider poetry a sacred vocation. reaching.
I always think it because it leaves more space for imagination in some way, that
Hmm.
ends up becoming, you can own a poem in a way that it's harder to own a work. I mean like a novel or something, because there's so much that the novelist or the memoirist has done to fill out the whole story. And in a poem, I always feel like there's so much that's done, but there's also so much that's left
Yes.
for personal input and interpretation.
Well, you're absolutely right, Stephanie. I mean, you hit on the thing exactly, that what you leave out of a poem is just as important as what you keep in. It allows the reader to make those connections. And that's what I think the best writing is anyway, whether it's a novel or what, you know, you want the reader to be involved in the story. You don't want to tell in your stories about, you know, the painters, you don't want to tell everything. You want to leave something out so the reader starts making those connections instead of being given those connections on a spoon, you know. And it's in that way in poetry. And there's an almost irrational joy in the language in poetry, you know, and we can make our associative leaps with that poet and be different. It's about seeing the tiny, tiny, tiny things.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, William Stafford said, poetry is like seeing a star out of the corner of your eye. If you look directly at it, you can't see it. But if you look out of the corner of your eye, it comes in. And that's been one of the best definitions ever of poetry that I've come across.
How did you, though, make the transition from poet, which is so specific in like every single syllable of every single word, to go to a long form memoir? Like those are two different things, aren't they? Or are they not? Are they more similar than I'm giving them credit for?
Well, I mean, what I left out of the memoir is just as important as what was left in.
Okay.
I mean, there's one similarity, and I would say that it was a freedom when I first started, because I had a whole landscape of the Midwest and the South and the North, and you know what I mean, of a country to play with the memoir. It felt very big, and it was. And it was a joy to me. I mean, I've written essays for a long time, and I was an art critic for quite a few years when I lived in New Mexico. So I was used to writing prose, but this was a different kind of thing to write about. But poetry came in handy all the time. I was always a poet as I was writing it, because, you know, you notice the little tiny things, and you see the nuance and that connective tissue between the metaphor and the larger story. It was fun to do it. It's all an adventure, isn't it? I mean, we write our way in. We don't really know. We just write our way in and see what happens.
This memoir came out in February of 2020.
Yeah.
Was just before the whole world closed itself down. I know that this is your debut memoir anyway. It's your debut, like, long form. You've had other writing out, but this is the debut thing. So it's hard to compare because you don't have anything to compare it to. But how was it? Did you have to cancel events after the pandemic closed down? How has this affected you emotionally, mentally, just the being out celebrating your debut book?
Well, first of all, I was super lucky. It came out February 2nd, and entire month of February, I had the most grand readings. And here in Port Townsend, Washington, where I live, the Rose Theater book, you know, it was sold out for 2 shows at the Rose Theater. It was just fantastic. And Buddy did a hoofograph, not at the Rose Theater, but my husband made a cool stamp, which I can show you. And I got the hoofograph, everybody's book. And that was so fun in Port Townsend. So I had 2 shows here. I had 2 wonderful readings in Seattle with the Hoofograph. And and it was really great. Then I had another reading, and I was in a TEDx. I did a TEDx talk. It was with poetry, but I talked about the book, and that. And then boom, everything stopped. So all my trips there, other places in Washington, and all the plans, and I had a New York, Boston, New Hampshire, Vermont trip that was canceled. But the Boston bookshop, it was about maybe 3 weeks ago now, maybe, they did a virtual reading for me. And the Bellingham shop has just asked me to do a virtual reading. So I guess this is what we're doing.
Okay, so it's really hard to tell with expectations because the pandemic was crazy. But you did have a month. And again, it's still continuing on. People are still reading. We're still doing digital events. It's just shifted. It's just changed. Yeah. So how has the putting the book out compared thus far to the expectations you had in your head? Has it lived up to everything? Has it fallen short? What's been your experience?
That's a really good question. I could easily say, oh, it's too bad about New York and everything. I mean, I had my friend, the poet Marie Howe, she and I are going to read together. She said, it'll happen. It'll happen. We'll do it in New York. There's more time. It doesn't have to be just when the book comes out. That's the beautiful thing. So, no, in a way, Stephanie, it has been just fantastic. I'm because it's still happening. It's not just the first month. People are writing and things are happening. People are asking me to do readings and book clubs, and I'm floating on gratitude. I have to tell you, one of my favorite moments before we go is when I found the painting that I wanted to be on my cover. And all my friends said, you won't get to decide the cover. You won't get to decide it. Don't get your hopes up. But I send it to my lovely editor, Lily. And
our lovely editor. We share an editor.
I just want to say our lovely editor.
Lily Golden. She's brilliant. Hi, Lily. Okay.
Hi, Lily. Hi, Lily. We love you. And this is the cover of the book. And I had to search long and hard to find the artist because I found it on the internet. And then when I found her, she was thrilled. And now we're friends on Facebook and Instagram. We love each other. She's, told people about it in France. And, I found it's just fantastic. We had to translate our messages. But
so she's a French artist.
She's a French artist of horses. And I had found this picture long before my wonderful agent, Gail Hockman, sold the book.
Now, I do have to ask one other thing, though. Did you pick the horse because the horse looks like Buddy, or because the horse has the spirit of Buddy?
Both.
Okay.
Because Buddy he's white, he's Arabian, he has a little dish face, kind of like this one, and his eyes, he has this little bright-eyed thing. And also because he has the spirit of this. That's a good question. That's a super good question.
Horses are both. They're both what they look like, and they're both their personality.
He has such a personality. He fetches my hat. I'm now riding him without a saddle or bridle in the round pen, and we're riding just by balance now. Going on.
That's terrifying and fantastic and exciting, and I love it. Thank you so much for joining me, Christine. This has been a lovely conversation.
I've had a blast.
Your book has been so lovely so far. I just think it's beautiful, and
thank you.
And I'm hoping that book clubs do. I think it's a total book club pick. I think it's a total sit around, drink some wine, talk about your families and the
great.
Well, and the joys of life.
So. I hope so. That's great. And I'm loving yours too. I'm almost done. And I just think that Raphael book is fantastic. And
See, this is why Lily's so great. She picked 2 good books. Okay.
I know. Isn't that fantastic?
Stephanie story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories in a novel way. Story time with Stephanie.